Good evening, everyone. Tonight, as, as I have done for the last few years, is retelling the story. And, you know, even in the Bible, Moses encouraged his people to tell the story of the people of their flight in Egypt to the new promised land. So tonight, I will again tell the story of the Tacloban UCCP. It is entitled In Retrospect. I got this material from several souvenir programs, and I just collated them and put them in a PowerPoint. So to start with, let's have a timeline. So in 1899, this was shortly after the American-Spanish War, the Battle of Manila. Admiral Dewey won there outstandingly. So in 1899, the first regular mission of the Presbyterian Church in USA, in the person of Dr. James Rogers, arrived in April 1899, followed 1 month after by Dr. Hibbard. Remember that name for those who are from Siliman? Dr. Hibbard. Visiting in 1901, the visiting Presbyterian Board Secretary, Dr. Arthur J. Brown, Dr. Divinity, had urged the early occupation of Leyte, since neither Presbyterian nor Baptist who had been assigned to the Visayas had as yet made no move to occupy Leyte. As a short background there, when the evangelicals came, the Americans came, bringing with them the evangelical Protestantism, they gathered together and agreed and divided the Philippines into their different missions. So it was the Presbyterian, where this church was founded, was assigned in southern Tagalog, the whole of Bicol region, Leyte, and Samar. So, in 1903, two men from Tacloban called on Reverend Johnson in Cebu and asked for a Protestant evangelist to come to them. Johnson himself, an evangelist, and evangelist Francisco Ivalarosa came to Tacloban in July 3 for a few days of religious meetings. Returning alone to Cebu, Johnson promptly dispatched Pablo Dia to join Ivalarosa. The opening of the Tacloban station, the Presbyterians called them the mission as stations. They have the Cebu station, the Kawit station, and the Leyte Tacloban station. So when it means station, is the mission. The evangelists found their first hearers among Tagalogs, who had heard of Protestant teachings before they emigrated to the Visayas. These settlers probably belonged to the same group as the two Protestant families of fishermen originally of the Kawit Evangelical Church in Cavite, who had moved to Carigara later. In September 1903, Reverend Dr. Paul Doltz of the Iloilo Mission Station visited Tacloban and found 13 well-instructed converts whom he had accordingly baptized. This marked the birth of Iglesia Evangelica, later to become the United Evangelical Church, and now the Tacloban UCCP. Towards the end of 1903, Reverend Charles E. Rudd settled in Tacloban. Practically no evangelistic gains were obtained in the next 6 years or so. Though Rudd's biggest problem was the question of language, it was also true that the Leyteños at this time generally showed little interest in the Protestant message. As Rogers would later sadly recall, Rogers is sort of our historian for the Philippine mission, who was the first to come. He says, and I quote him, and I quote from his report, "Of all the fields that our mission has entered, no place has been so obstinately opposed to our teaching as Tacloban. There was persecution of a petty nature, stoning of meetings, and it was even stated that the members of the families of those who attended the service were among the culprits. There was an American garrison in Tacloban at that time, and through the intervention of the chaplains, means were taken to stop these persecutions. However, even so, it took a long while to gain the confidence of the people," unquote. So in 1905, the first Protestant church in Leyte rose on the same lot where our church now stands, this lot. It was built out of light materials. This was replaced by a concrete structure 9 years later, because I understand there was a big storm, Yolanda-like, in 1911, I think, or 1912. This was replaced by a concrete structure 9 years later, and more intense persecution followed. In 1907, only some 11 new converts had been added since 1903, and of the 13 original members, only 9 remain. Even the 2 men who had invited Johnson to come have left the fellowship. Thus, Roth in 1907 transferred his residence to Baybay, where the people seemed more open to Protestant preaching, while Ibalorosa also moved his residence to Maasin. After 5 years, in 1912, after his marriage to Teresa Calv of the Manila station, Charles Roth decided to return to Tacloban. And in 1913, Dr. and Mrs. Warren Miller established a medical ministry based in Tacloban. This was the start of our health ministry. In 1918, the Presbyterian Mission and Dr. Miller, who, with the help of friends in the U.S., particularly St. Paul's Church in Philadelphia, put up the Bethany Mission Hospital. So I'd like to just point out that the medical mission is part of our church, mission of the church during the time. So the Leyte field in 1920 was divided into 3 circuits. The Maasin circuit assigned to Reverend Balarosa, assisted by Evangelist Gaudencio Acopilado and his wife, the former Vicenta Laison, an efficient Christian worker in Tacloban for many years. Bible circuit was assigned to Reverend and Mrs. Monte de Ramos, assisted by Angel C. Espina. And the 3rd circuit comprised the northwestern Samareño-speaking portion of Leyte with Severino Abiera stationed in Buraben, while Evangelist Magno Managbanag and wife stayed in Tacloban to take care of the boys' dorm and the small Tacloban congregation. Assisting Abiera for a time, the evangelist assisting Abiera was the evangelist Bernardo Talero. When ill health, Forlo left no missionary on Leyte in 1921-22. These Filipino workers ably maintained the work. In 1923, the Presbyterian Mission decided to recall the Millers on account of poor health and to close the Leyte Mission Hospital. And as the Roths had been transferred to Cebu in 1923, the only missionaries left were the Reverend and Mrs. Albert Spielberger and Miss Alice Fullerton, a registered nurse, who came in 1922. But in 1924, the Spielbergers transferred to Manila, with Miss Fullerton remained in Tacloban till new personal reinforcements came the following year. In 1925, as a result of the Baptist-Presbyterian exchange of territory, the Presbyterians withdrew from Panay and took over Samar. Thus, the Reverend Dr. and Mrs. Andrew Hall and the Reverend Frederick Dawson moved to Tacloban. Not long afterwards, the Dawsons moved to Catbalogan to open up Samar Mission Station. I think he is the founder of the Catbalogan Church. And on the same year, Dr. Hall and Dr. Fernandez reopened Leyte Mission Hospital, which is now the Bethany. And in 1927, Reverend and Alfred Sanders arrived in Tacloban and joined the Dawsons a year later and took charge of the Samar Mission when the Dawsons were on furlough. In 1932, Reverend and Mrs. Ernest J. Fry, I think he was a Swiss man, arrived and chose to locate in Burawin. And in 1939, the Reverend Leonard Hagenboom, and of course, in 1941 to 1944 were the World War II years. I'd like to mention the post-war years of the fraternal missionaries, post-war. Some of you may know them, and some of our older people know them. The Reverend Hall B. Lloyd, Reverend and Mrs. Irvin Winship, Reverend and Mrs. Paul Walter, Dr. and Mrs. McAnlis. Now I'd like to talk about the pioneers of the Protestant faith in this church. The pioneering families who undertook the task of sowing the seed were not many. However, as time passed, the few increased in number. We acknowledge with deep gratitude their dedication and faithfulness. By mentioning their names here, we may have no record of the 13 converts. We don't have any records, but we know they are Tagalog. But we shall more than make it by recognizing the ones who came behind them. We have 1903 to 1915, we have Eulalio Santa Maria and the Alejandro Gregorio. In the early 20s, we had Eulalia B. Bañez and her 9 children. The Managbanags, they were known for their singing. And in the 1920s, Matias and Ricarda Gadaingan, and Mr. Monico Soriano. In the middle 20s, we have Leonardo de Paz, or Manadangdang, for I think some of you met her, who later married Mr. Bernardino Romero in the late 1930s. We have also the Hikains in the middle 20s. We have Mariano Hikain with their children, the Eduliantes, the Gracias, Mr. Eufrasia Alcober, and the Arribes of Leyte. Then we have, this is in the 1920s and to the 30s, with the Singson and Compendio families, Engineer Jose Garrido Sr., the Martinezes, the Quirino Elias families, Jacinto G. Loyola Sr., who later became the pastor of this church for 18 years. And the 1930s, the pre-war years, we have Mr. Evaristo Granali and family who came from Dumaguete in 1934, Mr. Braulio Larino Sr. and wife Romana La Cuesta, and Mr. and Mrs. Crispin Henotiva, Mr. Teopila Amanso Sr., Mrs. Siriaca Cañete, Dr. and Mrs. Arcadio Ortiz, with wife Gertrudes Fuentes, Dr. and Mrs. Julio E. Dolorico, and with me, Jeneline Necia Dolorico. Many of these families became pillars of the church, serving in various leadership capacities. These were families who made up the church of yesterday, their children, are the families that make up the church, today, and their children's children will be the church leaders and members of tomorrow. The war years and the post-liberation period. The Japanese occupation did not disrupt the life of the church. Services were held at first where the members are evacuated, later resuming the same at the church building, even as the Japanese continued to use the Christian education building, until Tacloban was freed from its oppressor. The liberation period ushered in more members coming from other places, lured by many job openings at that time. It was during this time that the Tacloban Academy, a church-related educational institution, was founded by Dr. Arcadio A. Ortiz Sr. and Mr. Evaristo Granale. Its life was short-lived, however, and it was also during this time, in May 1925-1948, that the United Church of Christ in the Philippines was born. Go on and on, but these are the only, might take up much of your time. I'd just like to acknowledge that while I was presented this some time ago, I was handed down a note by Mrs. Letty Hesitate. And she says that the great-grandfather, Lola's husband, was Emilio Redima, and the wife of Maxima Canayong Redima, known by the latest summer conference as Mana Sima. I cannot put them somewhere, but this was probably shortly in the late 1930s, shortly before the war. So I will have to confirm this to the one who gave me the information so that I can make the adjustments. With that, I'd like to cut this history of the church. The others are how we develop as a church, but I'd like to end here until our May 25, 1948, until we became the United Church of Christ in the Philippines was born, because this is another story of how the missions combined became the United Church of Christ in the Philippines. With that, I'd like to close, and happy anniversary to everyone.